The crack of the whip split the afternoon air like thunder, and Clara Hayes tasted blood as she stumbled forward, her knees hitting the dusty ground behind the Thornton Manor in Abilene, Kansas, where the summer heat of 1878 made every breath feel like swallowing fire. She had known the punishment would come the moment she stepped between Overseer William Graves and 15-year-old Lily Patterson, the fragile serving girl who had accidentally broken Mrs. Thornton's prized china teapot while carrying the afternoon tea service. Clara had watched the color drain from Lily's face as Graves reached for his belt, his eyes gleaming with the particular cruelty he reserved for the servants who worked under his watch. Without thinking, Clara had pushed herself forward, her 22 years giving her a courage that Lily's youth could not yet command, and she had said the words that sealed her fate. "It was my fault, sir. I bumped into her carrying the tray." The lie had been transparent, witnessed by 3 other servants who stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, but Clara had met Graves's stare without flinching. She knew the rules of the Thornton household, where wealthy Kansas City investors had purchased this sprawling estate on the edge of the cattle town. Servants were property in all but name, bound by contracts that kept them working for room and board with wages so small they could never afford to leave. The Thorntons considered themselves progressive for hiring help rather than using actual slaves, which had been illegal for over a decade. But the difference felt academic when Graves dragged Clara out to the yard behind the stables. The second lash came down across her shoulders, and Clara bit her lip to keep from crying out. She would not give Graves the satisfaction. Through the haze of pain, she heard Lily sobbing somewhere behind her, begging Graves to stop, but the overseer only laughed and raised his arm again. "You should learn your place, girl," Graves snarled, his breath reeking of whiskey even in the middle of the afternoon. "You do not lie to protect other servants. You do not interfere with discipline. You do nothing but what you are told." The third strike never came. Clara heard a sound like a pistol being cocked, sharp and unmistakable, and then a voice rolled across the yard with the kind of quiet authority that made dangerous men pause. "Drop the whip." She turned her head, her vision swimming, and saw a man standing at the edge of the yard with the sun behind him. He was tall and lean, wearing dusty trail clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. His hand rested on the revolver at his hip, and though he had not drawn it, the threat was clear in his posture. Clara had seen enough cowboys and drifters pass through Abilene to recognize someone who knew how to use a gun. Graves spun around, his face flushing red. "This is private property, mister. You have no business here." "I have business with Mr. Thornton," the cowboy said, stepping forward into the light. Clara could see him better now. He looked to be in his mid-20s, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. His eyes were a striking blue-gray, and they were fixed on Graves with an intensity that made the overseer take a step back. "I am here to discuss purchasing cattle for my ranch up near Dodge City, but I do not conduct business with men who beat women." "These are servants," Graves said, recovering some of his bluster. "They require discipline." "They require decent treatment," the cowboy corrected. His gaze shifted to Clara and something flickered in his expression. "Can you stand, miss?" Clara nodded, though her back screamed in protest as she pushed herself to her feet. The world tilted slightly, but she steadied herself through sheer will. She would not collapse in front of this stranger, no matter how much her body wanted to betray her. "What is your name?" the cowboy asked. "Clara Hayes," she managed, her voice rougher than she intended. "And the other girl, Lily Patterson." Clara glanced over her shoulder to where Lily huddled near the kitchen door, her eyes wide with fear. The cowboy nodded slowly, as if making a decision. Then he turned back to Graves. "Go tell Mr. Thornton that James Cordell is here to see him. Tell him I am interested in buying 100 head of his cattle, but first we need to discuss his employment practices." Graves opened his mouth to argue, but something in Cordell's expression stopped him. With a muttered curse, he threw down the whip and stalked toward the main house, leaving Clara and Lily alone with their unexpected rescuer. Cordell moved closer, his movements careful as if approaching a skittish horse. "How badly are you hurt?" "I will survive," Clara said, though she could feel blood soaking through the back of her dress. 3 lashes were not the worst punishment Graves had dealt out, but they were enough to leave scars. "That is not what I asked." Cordell's voice was gentle now, and Clara found herself looking at him properly for the first time. There was kindness in his face mixed with anger at what he had witnessed. "You should not have to survive this. No one should." "It is the way of things," Clara said, hating how defeated the words sounded. "It does not have to be." Cordell turned to Lily, who was still trembling near the doorway. "Come here, miss. I promise I mean you no harm." Lily crept forward slowly, her mousy brown hair falling across her face. She was small for her age, barely reaching Clara's shoulder, and her arms bore the faded marks of older bruises. Clara had tried to protect her as much as possible over the past 6 months since Lily had been hired, but Graves seemed to take particular pleasure in tormenting the girl. "What is your contract situation?" Cordell asked, looking between the 2 women. Clara swallowed hard. "We both signed 3-year contracts. I have 8 months remaining. Lily has 2.5 years. "And what do you earn?" $5 a month plus room and board, Clara said. "Lily earns 3. Cordell's jaw tightened. "That is barely enough to buy shoes, let alone save for a better situation. How much would it cost to buy out your contracts?" Clara stared at him, not understanding. "Buy out our contracts. The Thorntons can be bought," Cordell said flatly. "Everything can be bought from men like them. I am asking how much." "I do not know," Clara admitted. "No one has ever tried to buy out a servant's contract before. Then we are about to find out." Cordell gestured toward the main house, where Graves was emerging with Mr. Thornton himself, a portly man in his 50s with gray whiskers and an expression of practiced charm that fooled nobody who worked for him. "Mr. Cordell," Thornton called out, spreading his arms in a gesture of false welcome. "My overseer tells me you are interested in cattle. Come inside, we will discuss terms over brandy." "I will discuss terms right here," Cordell said, not moving. "I want to buy out the contracts of these 2 women. Thornton's smile faltered. "I beg your pardon, Miss Hayes and Miss Patterson. I want to hire them for my ranch." "Name your price for releasing them from their obligations." Thornton glanced at Graves, then back at Cordell, clearly trying to calculate whether this was some kind of trick. "Mr. Cordell, these girls are under contract. They have obligations to fulfill. And I am offering to compensate you for ending those obligations early," Cordell said. His hand drifted to his hip, not quite touching his gun but reminding everyone it was there. "Unless you would prefer to discuss why your overseer was whipping an unarmed woman in your yard." "I imagine the sheriff might have opinions about that, even in a town like Abilene." Thornton's face darkened. "What happens on my property is my business." "What happens to people is everyone's business," Cordell countered. "Now we can do this 2 ways. You can name a fair price, I will pay it, and we will part as businessmen. Or I can walk into town and tell everyone I meet that James Thornton runs his house like a slave plantation, and we can see how that affects your reputation among the cattle buyers who pass through here." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Abilene's economy depended on the cattle trade, and reputation meant everything. A whisper campaign from a rancher like Cordell, who Clara guessed had connections throughout Kansas, could damage Thornton's business significantly. Thornton's calculating eyes moved from Cordell to Clara and Lily, weighing his options. Finally, he said, $200 for both contracts. Take it or leave it." It was an outrageous sum, nearly 4 years' worth of combined wages, but Cordell did not even blink. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather wallet, counting out bills with practiced ease. Clara watched in disbelief as he handed the money to Thornton. "Draw up the paperwork," Cordell said. "I want legal releases stating they are free of all obligations to you." Thornton snatched the money, his greed overwhelming whatever pride he might have felt. Graves, fetch the contracts and the release forms. Mr. Cordell, you are making a mistake. These girls are more trouble than they are worth. I will be the judge of that, Cordell said calmly. 20 minutes later, Clara and Lily stood in the dusty yard holding pieces of paper that declared them free of their contracts with the Thornton household. Clara's hands trembled as she stared at the document, unable to quite believe what had just happened. A stranger had walked into her life, witnessed an injustice, and simply bought her freedom as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Get your belongings, Cordell told them. Whatever you want to take with you, we leave in 10 minutes. Clara and Lily rushed to the servants' quarters, a cramped room they shared with two other girls who watched them pack with envious eyes. Clara owned almost nothing: 2 spare dresses, a hairbrush her mother had given her before dying of fever 5 years ago, and a small Bible that was falling apart at the seams. Lily had even less. Within minutes, they were back outside where Cordell waited with 3 horses. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Yes," Clara said. She had grown up on a small farm before her father drank himself to death and left her with debts that drove her into service. Lily nodded too, though she looked nervous. "Good. It is a 3-day ride to my ranch outside Dodge City. We will take it slow, camp at night, and get there by Monday." Cordell helped Lily onto one horse, then turned to Clara. She winced as she lifted her arms, her back still burning from the whip, and Cordell's expression darkened again. "We need to tend those wounds tonight when we make camp." Clara wanted to argue that she could manage, but the concern in his voice stopped her. Instead, she let him help her into the saddle, biting back a gasp as the movement pulled at the cuts on her shoulders. Then Cordell mounted his own horse, a powerful bay gelding that looked like it had carried him across half of Kansas, and they rode away from the Thornton estate without looking back. They traveled north and west, following the trails that the cattle drives used in the spring and summer. The landscape was rolling prairie, broken by occasional stands of cottonwood trees and creeks that ran low in the August heat. Cordell set a steady pace, stopping frequently to let the horses rest and checking often to make sure Clara and Lily were managing. He did not speak much, but his silence felt companionable rather than cold. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Cordell led them to a campsite near a creek with good grass for the horses. He unpacked his saddlebags with efficient movements, clearly a man who had spent countless nights on the trail. Within minutes, he had a fire going and coffee brewing in a battered tin pot. "Miss Hayes," he said quietly, "I need to look at your back. Those wounds need cleaning or they will fester." Clara's instinct was to refuse, to maintain some shred of dignity, but she knew he was right. She had seen infections kill strong men in a matter of days. Slowly, she turned her back to him and lowered the torn fabric of her dress, exposing the 3 angry welts that crossed her shoulders. She heard Cordell's sharp intake of breath. "That bastard," he muttered. Then, more gently, "This will hurt, but I will be as quick as I can." He cleaned the wounds with water from the creek and whiskey from his flask, and Clara clenched her teeth against the burning pain. His hands were surprisingly gentle, his touch careful and respectful. When he finished, he tore strips from a clean shirt in his pack and bandaged her shoulders. "You should not have stepped in front of that whip," Cordell said as he worked, "but I am glad you did." "Why?" Clara asked, surprised. "Because it showed me the kind of person you are," Cordell said simply. "Someone willing to take punishment to protect another. That takes courage." "It takes foolishness," Clara said, but there was no heat in her words. "Sometimes they are the same thing." Cordell tied off the bandage and moved back, letting Clara adjust her dress. "You should rest. Tomorrow will be another long day." But Clara found she did not want to rest yet. There were too many questions burning in her mind. "Why did you do it? Why did you spend all that money to buy out our contracts? You do not know us." Cordell poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed her one. The liquid was strong and bitter, but it warmed her from the inside. He sat down across the fire from her, his face thoughtful in the flickering light. "My mother was a servant," he said finally. "Back in Missouri before the war, She worked for a family that treated her like property, same as the Thorntons treated you. When I was 8 years old, the master of the house tried to force himself on her. She fought back and he beat her so badly she never fully recovered. She died when I was 12. Clara's breath caught. I am sorry. So am I. Cordell stared into the fire. I swore then that if I ever had the means, I would help people in situations like hers, like yours. I built my ranch from nothing over the past 5 years, saved every dollar, bought land when it was cheap. Now I have enough to make a difference, even if it is just for 2 people. What will we do at your ranch? Lily asked quietly. She had been so silent that Clara had almost forgotten she was there, sitting wrapped in a blanket near the fire. Whatever you want, Cordell said, looking at her with the same gentle expression he had shown Clara. I need help, that is true. I have a house that needs maintaining and I am a terrible cook. But I will pay you fair wages, 5 times what Thornton was giving you. You will have your own rooms, your own time. If you decide after a month that you want to leave, I will give you a month's wages and help you find another situation. No contracts, no obligations beyond basic decency. Why would you do that? Clara asked, still not quite believing it. Because it is the right thing to do, Cordell said, as if it were obvious. Because my mother deserved better, and so do you. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the creek burble and the horses shift in the grass. Clara studied Cordell over the rim of her coffee cup, taking in the lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into sun and wind, the scars on his knuckles that told of hard work and harder fights. He was handsome in a rugged way, but it was his fundamental decency that drew her attention. In her experience, men with power used it for their own gain. Cordell seemed to be trying to use his power to help others, and that was as rare as finding gold in a creek bed. Thank you, Clara said finally, inadequately, for everything. Cordell met her eyes and something passed between them, a recognition of shared pain and shared hope. You are welcome, Miss Hayes. Now get some rest. We have a long way to go. That night, Clara lay in her bedroll staring at the stars and thinking about the strange turn her life had taken. This morning, she had been a servant with no prospects and no hope. Now she was riding toward a new life with a man who had risked confrontation and spent a fortune to free her. She did not know what to make of James Cordell, but she found herself wanting to understand him, to know what drove a man to act with such immediate compassion. The next 2 days of travel passed in a rhythm of riding, resting, and campfire conversations. Cordell proved to be a skilled guide and a surprisingly good storyteller. He told them about his ranch, which he had named the Double C after his initials, and about the 10 hands he employed to help manage his growing herd of cattle. He spoke about the challenges of ranching in Kansas, the droughts and the winter storms, the constant threat of rustlers and the delicate negotiations with the railroad companies that controlled the shipping prices. But he also asked questions, drawing out Clara's story with genuine interest. She found herself telling him about her childhood on the farm, her father's decline after her mother's death, the desperate years of trying to keep the land before the bank foreclosed. She spoke about entering service as the only option left to her, the grinding monotony of the work, the small kindnesses between servants that made life bearable. Lily, encouraged by Clara's openness, began to share her own history. Orphaned at 10, passed between distant relatives who did not want her, finally sold into service by an uncle who needed drinking money. Cordell listened to all of it without judgment or pity, just a quiet attention that made Clara feel heard in a way she had not experienced in years. She caught herself watching him as they rode, noticing the way he sat his horse with easy confidence, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon for threats, the gentle patience he showed when Lily's horse acted skittish. He was unlike any man she had known, and she felt something stirring in her chest that she had thought dead after years of hard service. They reached the Double C Ranch on a Monday afternoon, as Cordell had predicted. The ranch was modest but well maintained. A sturdy two-story house built of timber and stone, a large barn, several outbuildings and corrals that held dozens of horses and cattle. The land stretched for miles in every direction, rolling grassland that shimmered in the summer heat. It was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way, and Clara felt something ease in her chest at the sight of so much open space. 4 ranch hands emerged from the barn as they rode up. Men in their 20s and 30s, with the weathered look of cowboys who spent more time outdoors than in. Cordell introduced them as Tom, Bill, Henry, and Jack, and they greeted Clara and Lily with polite nods and curious glances. "Boys, this is Miss Hayes and Miss Patterson," Cordell said as they dismounted. "They will be working at the house. I expect you to treat them with respect, same as you would your own sisters. Anyone who does not can find employment elsewhere." The message was clear, and the hands nodded their understanding. Tom, who seemed to be the oldest at around 35, even offered to help carry their meager belongings into the house. The interior of the house surprised Clara. It was clean but Spartan, with simple furniture and few decorations. The kitchen was large and well-equipped, clearly the workspace of someone who valued function over form. Upstairs, Cordell showed them to 2 bedrooms that were more spacious than any sleeping quarters Clara had occupied since leaving her childhood home. "These are yours," Cordell said. "The washroom is at the end of the hall. My room is downstairs. Take today to settle in and rest. Tomorrow we can discuss what you feel comfortable doing around the place." After he left, Clara and Lily stood in Clara's new room, staring at each other in disbelief. "Is this real?" Lily whispered. "I think so," Clara said, though she kept expecting to wake up back in the servants' quarters at the Thornton estate. She walked to the window and looked out over the ranch, watching Cordell cross the yard to speak with his hands. Even from a distance, she could see the easy camaraderie between them, the respect they showed him. He was a good employer, she realized. The kind of man who led by example rather than fear. That night, Clara insisted on cooking dinner despite Cordell's protests. Her back was healing, and she needed to do something to prove her worth. She made a simple stew from the supplies in the larder, served with fresh bread that Lily helped her bake. The ranch hands ate in the bunkhouse, but Cordell joined Clara and Lily at the kitchen table, and the 3 of them shared a meal that felt almost like family. "This is excellent," Cordell said after his first bite. "Far better than anything I have managed to produce." "I should hope so," Clara said, allowing herself a small smile. "You hired us to cook after all." "I hired you to be safe," Cordell corrected gently. "The cooking is just a benefit." Over the following weeks, Clara and Lily settled into life at the Double C. They rose early to prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, spent mornings cleaning and maintaining the house, and used their afternoons however they wished. Clara found herself drawn to the garden behind the house, coaxing vegetables and herbs from the stubborn Kansas soil. Lily discovered a talent for mending and sewing, repairing the cowboys' worn clothes, and even making new shirts from fabric Cordell bought in Dodge City. True to his word, Cordell paid them at the end of the first month. $25 each, more money than Clara had ever held at one time. She stared at the bills in her hand, feeling the weight of possibility they represented. For the first time in years, she had the means to imagine a different future. But more than the money or the work, Clara found herself drawn to the man who had made it all possible. She and Cordell fell into a pattern of evening conversations on the porch after dinner, talking about everything from cattle prices to philosophy while the sun set over the prairie. She learned that he was 26 years old, just 4 years her senior, and that he had fought briefly in the tail end of the Indian Wars before deciding he wanted to build rather than destroy. He had a sharp mind and a dry sense of humor that emerged once he relaxed, and Clara found herself laughing more than she had in years. She also noticed the way he looked at her sometimes, when he thought she was not paying attention. There was admiration in his gaze, mixed with something warmer and more uncertain. It made her heart beat faster, though she tried to tell herself she was being foolish. Men like James Cordell did not fall for servants, even servants they had freed. There were social barriers that charity alone could not overcome. But then came the night of the summer storm when everything changed. It was late August, nearly a month after their arrival at the ranch. The air had been heavy and oppressive all day, the sky turning a sickly green as evening approached. Clara was in the kitchen cleaning up from dinner when the first drops of rain began to fall. Within minutes, it was a deluge, water sheeting down so hard she could barely see the barn through the window. Thunder cracked overhead like artillery, and the house shook with the force of it. Lily had gone to bed early with a headache, so Clara was alone when Cordell came in from securing the animals, drenched to the skin and breathing hard. He stripped off his sodden jacket and hung it by the door, running a hand through his dripping hair. "That came on fast," he said. "Are the horses all right?" Clara asked, moving to pour him coffee from the pot she kept warm on the stove. "Fine, nervous but fine." Cordell accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping his hands around it. "Tom and Jack are staying in the barn tonight to keep them calm. The rest of the boys are in the bunkhouse." Lightning flashed, illuminating the kitchen in stark white light, and thunder followed almost immediately. Clara flinched despite herself. She had never liked storms, not since the tornado that nearly destroyed her family's farm when she was a child. "You are safe here," Cordell said quietly, noticing her reaction. "This house has weathered worse." "I know," Clara said, but her voice shook slightly. Another crash of thunder made her jump, and before she could stop herself, she had moved closer to Cordell, seeking the comfort of another person's presence. He set down his coffee cup and, after a moment's hesitation, put his hand on her shoulder. The touch was gentle, careful not to press on the still healing scars from the whip. "It is just noise," he said. "It cannot hurt you." Clara looked up at him, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. She could see the drops of rain caught in his eyelashes, the concern in his eyes, the strength in the line of his jaw. Her breath caught as something shifted between them, the comfortable friendship of the past weeks transforming into something deeper and more electric than the storm raging outside. "James," she said, using his first name for the first time. "Clara," he replied, and there was a question in his voice, a need for permission. She answered by rising on her toes and kissing him. For a moment he froze, clearly shocked. Then his arms came around her, pulling her close, and he was kissing her back with a fervor that took her breath away. It was not a gentle kiss or a tentative exploration. It was the kiss of two people who had been holding back for too long, who had been dancing around their feelings while trying to maintain propriety. Clara's hands fisted in his damp shirt, and she pressed against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the rapid beat of his heart that matched her own. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Cordell rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that since the day I met you," he admitted. "Since I saw you standing in that yard, bloodied but unbroken, protecting someone weaker than yourself." "I have wanted it too," Clara whispered. "I tried to tell myself it was impossible, that you could never see me as anything more than someone you helped. But James, I cannot stop thinking about you. I cannot stop feeling like my life truly began the day you rode into it." "You are not someone I helped," Cordell said fiercely, cupping her face in his hands. "You are the bravest, strongest woman I have ever met. You are beautiful and kind and everything I did not know I was looking for. Clara Hayes, I am falling in love with you and I do not care about propriety or what anyone might think. I only care about you." Tears sprang to Clara's eyes, but they were tears of joy. "I am falling in love with you too," she said. "I think I have been since you cocked that pistol and told Graves to drop his whip." They kissed again, softer this time, savoring the moment. The storm raged on outside, but inside the kitchen, they had found their own shelter, their own refuge in each other's arms. They stayed there for a long time, holding each other and talking in quiet voices about the feelings they had been suppressing, the hopes they had been afraid to voice. "What happens now?" Clara asked finally, practical even in the midst of emotion. Now we figure it out together, Cordell said. If you want to, that is. I know this is sudden and I know you have been through hell. I will go as slow as you need, Clara. I will wait as long as it takes. I do not want to wait, Clara said, surprising herself with her certainty. I have spent too much of my life waiting for things to get better, for someone to save me. You gave me the tools to save myself, James, and now I am choosing you. I am choosing this. Then I am the luckiest man in Kansas, Cordell said and kissed her once more. Their courtship over the following months was unconventional by the standards of 1878, but it felt right to both of them. They made no secret of their feelings, though they maintained separate bedrooms out of respect for propriety and for Lily, who was delighted to see Clara so happy. The ranch hands accepted the situation with equanimity, having already developed respect and affection for Clara in her time at the Double C. Tom even told Cordell privately that it was about time the boss found himself a good woman. As autumn painted the prairie in shades of gold and red, Cordell began talking about the future in concrete terms. He wanted to expand the ranch, buy more land, increase the herd. But more than that, he wanted to build something lasting, something that would endure beyond his lifetime. He wanted a family. "Marry me," he said one evening in October as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. It was not phrased as a question but as a statement of intention, a declaration of what he wanted with every fiber of his being. Clara turned to him, her heart full to bursting. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, James, I will marry you." They were wed in Dodge City on a crisp November morning with Lily and the ranch hands as witnesses. Clara wore a simple blue dress that Lily had sewn for her, and Cordell wore his best suit, looking both handsome and slightly uncomfortable in the formal clothes. The ceremony was brief, conducted by a justice of the peace who had known Cordell for years, and who seemed genuinely pleased to see him settling down. When the justice pronounced them husband and wife, Cordell kissed Clara with a tenderness that made her eyes sting with tears. This was real, she thought. This was her life now, not a dream or a temporary reprieve but a genuine new beginning. The ranch hands had organized a celebration back at the Double C, complete with a roast pig and enough whiskey to float a small boat. Even Lily danced, coaxed into a reel by young Jack, who had been nursing a quiet crush on her for weeks. Clara watched them with amusement, making a mental note to keep an eye on that developing situation. Lily was still only 15, too young for serious courting, but in a few years, if Jack proved himself worthy, Clara thought she might give the match her blessing. That night, Clara and Cordell finally came together as husband and wife in the bedroom that was now truly theirs. There was awkwardness at first, both of them nervous despite their feelings, but they worked through it with patience and humor and an abiding tenderness. Afterward, lying in Cordell's arms with the moonlight streaming through the window, Clara felt a peace she had never known. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," Cordell replied, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Every day for the rest of our lives, Clara, that is my promise to you." The first years of their marriage were not without challenges. Ranching was hard, unpredictable work, subject to the whims of weather and market forces beyond anyone's control. There were droughts that left the grass withered and brown, winters that froze cattle in the fields, rustlers who had to be chased off with rifles and hard words. Cordell worked from dawn to dusk, and Clara alongside him, managing the house and the accounts and increasingly taking on responsibilities around the ranch itself. But through it all, their love only deepened. They learned each other's rhythms, each other's needs. Cordell discovered that Clara had a head for numbers and business, and he began consulting her on major decisions about the ranch. Clara found that Cordell's exterior calm hid a playful streak, and she learned to coax out his laughter during the long winter evenings when work was slow. Lily bloomed under their care, growing from a frightened girl into a confident young woman. She continued to live at the ranch, taking on more responsibility as Clara's duties expanded. And as Clara had suspected, young Jack continued his courtship with patience and respect. When Lily turned 18 in the spring of 1881, Jack asked Cordell's permission to marry her, and Cordell, after ascertaining that Lily was genuinely interested, gave his blessing. The two were wed that summer in a ceremony that mirrored Clara and Cordell's own, simple but heartfelt. Jack built a small house on the eastern edge of the ranch, and he and Lily settled there, becoming an integral part of the Double C community. Clara was thrilled to have Lily so close, to watch her continue to thrive and build her own happy life. In the fall of 1881, Clara realized she was pregnant. The realization came gradually, a missed monthly cycle followed by morning nausea and an overwhelming fatigue that no amount of sleep seemed to cure. When she finally told Cordell, he swept her up in his arms with such joy that she laughed until she cried. "We are going to have a baby," he kept saying, as if he could not quite believe it. "Clara, we are going to be parents." Their son was born in May of 1882, arriving on a warm spring morning with a lusty cry that announced his presence to the entire ranch. They named him William, after Clara's father, with the hope that he would inherit only his grandfather's strengths and none of his weaknesses. Will, as they called him, had Cordell's blue-gray eyes and Clara's stubborn chin, and from the moment Clara held him, she felt her heart expand in ways she had not imagined possible. Cordell was a devoted father, doting on Will with an affection that might have been embarrassing if it had not been so endearing. He carried the boy everywhere during his first year, showing him the horses and the cattle, telling him stories about the ranch even though Will was far too young to understand. Clara watched them together and felt a contentment so profound, it sometimes frightened her with its intensity. 2 years later, their daughter Elizabeth was born, a tiny red-faced girl who screamed her displeasure at the world before settling into Clara's arms with a sigh. Beth, as they called her, was gentler than her brother, with Clara's dark hair and Cordell's easy smile. The ranch hands doted on both children, and Will and Beth grew up surrounded by love and the wide-open spaces of the Kansas prairie. The years rolled on, bringing changes and challenges but also deep satisfaction. The ranch prospered under Cordell's careful management and Clara's shrewd business sense. They expanded their land holdings, bought more cattle, hired additional hands. Cordell's reputation as a fair employer spread, and he never had trouble finding good men willing to work for him. More than one drifter found his way to the Double C after hearing that James Cordell treated his people right, and several stayed on for years. Lily and Jack had children of their own, 3 boys who played with Will and Beth and made the ranch ring with laughter. Tom eventually married a widow from Dodge City and brought her to live in a cottage they built near the main house. The Double C became less a ranch and more a community, a place where people looked after each other and worked toward common goals. In the evenings, after the work was done and the children were in bed, Clara and Cordell still sat on the porch as they had in the early days of their courtship. They were older now, marked by sun and wind and hard work, but the connection between them remained as strong as ever. Sometimes they talked about the past, marveling at how far they had come from that violent afternoon in Abilene. Other times, they planned for the future, discussing what they wanted to leave for their children and grandchildren. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked one evening in the summer of 1895. They had been married for 16 years and she was approaching 41, Cordell 45. Their children were 13 and 11, growing up strong and healthy. "Spending all that money to free Lily and me. You could have invested it in the ranch, bought more land earlier." Cordell looked at her with such love and affection that it still made her breath catch after all these years. "Not for a single moment," he said. "That money bought me everything that matters. It brought you into my life, Clara. It gave me a family, a purpose beyond just surviving and making money. I would spend it again 1,000 times over." "I love you," Clara said, the words as true now as they had been the first time she spoke them. "I love you too," Cordell replied, taking her hand. every day for the rest of our lives. That was my promise, and I have kept it." As the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in familiar shades of orange and pink, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had been whipped, broken, reduced to near servitude by circumstances beyond her control. But she had also been brave when it mattered most, willing to sacrifice herself to protect someone weaker. And that act of courage had brought James Cordell into her life, a man who saw injustice and simply acted to stop it, who valued human dignity over profit and who had the strength to back up his convictions. Their love story was not one of grand gestures or dramatic rescues, though it had started that way. It was a story of daily choices, of two people deciding again and again to choose each other, to build something together despite the hardships and uncertainties of frontier life. It was a story of redemption and second chances, of wounds healing and trust slowly rebuilt. Will came running around the corner of the house, chasing Beth while she shrieked with laughter. They tumbled onto the porch in a tangle of limbs, and Cordell scooped them both up with ease, tickling them until they begged for mercy. Clara watched them with a smile, thinking of the family they had created from nothing, the community they had built through fairness and compassion. This was her legacy, she thought. Not just the children she had borne or the ranch they had built, but the example they had set. That cruelty did not have to be accepted as inevitable. That one person with courage and resources could make a real difference. That love could flourish even in the harshest conditions if it was tended with care. As full darkness fell and the stars emerged overhead, the same stars that had watched over Clara and Cordell during their first journey together across the Kansas prairie, the family went inside together. There would be other challenges ahead, other storms to weather, but they would face them together, bound by love and the unshakable commitment they had made to each other all those years ago in Abilene. Clara Hayes Cordell had been whipped for protecting another servant girl. James Cordell had freed them both and hired them fair. And from that single act of courage met with compassion, an entire life had bloomed, rich, full, and endlessly worth living. The story that began with the crack of a whip and a stranger's intervention had become a love story for the ages, proving that even in the hardest times, in the wildest places, human decency and genuine affection could not only survive but thrive. The Double C Ranch stood as testament to that truth, a place where people were valued and justice mattered, where a servant girl and a cowboy had found each other and built something that would endure long after they were gone. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the children asleep, Clara would sometimes touch the faded scars on her shoulders and remember. Not the pain, which had long since faded, but the moment James Cordell stepped forward and said 3 simple words that changed her life forever. "Drop the whip." Those words had been the beginning of everything good in her life, and she carried them in her heart like a prayer, a reminder that courage and compassion could overcome even the cruelest circumstances. She had been saved, yes, but more importantly, she had been seen, valued, and loved for exactly who she was. And that, she thought, was the greatest gift anyone could receive. Their love story was complete, a circle closed, a promise kept. James and Clara Cordell had found their happily ever after not in spite of the hardships they faced, but because they faced them together, with unwavering devotion and an abiding faith in each other. The Wild West had been tamed, not by guns or violence, but by the quiet persistence of decent people building decent lives, one day at a time. And that was how a servant girl and a cowboy found forever in the Kansas prairie, under the endless western sky, surrounded by the family and community they had created together. Their story would be told for generations in those parts, a reminder that love and justice were worth fighting for, and that sometimes the greatest adventures began with the simplest act of standing up for what was right.